the Federation survived the Borg. That is the story recorded in operational logs, in memorial plaques, in the tactical analyses filed after Wolf 359. Survival is written into the historical record as victory, but survival is not the same as winning, and the Borg were never truly defeated. They were delayed. They were disrupted. They were repelled in specific encounters by narrow margins under extraordinary circumstances. But they were never outpaced, never outbuilt, and never strategically outmaneuvered on a systemic level. The galaxy did not overcome the Borg through superior strength or doctrine. It exploited fractures. It struck at rare internal contradictions. It relied on individuals positioned at the exact moment a singular vulnerability opened. Remove any one of those individuals, shift the timing by days, and the outcome changes. The Borg came within reach of an irreversible galactic realignment, not once, but repeatedly. And the mechanism that delayed them was not ingenuity or moral resolve. It was structural instability within the collective itself, instability the Borg were continuously adapting to eliminate. The common belief is that individuality defeated the Borg, that human unpredictability, Starfleet improvisation, and the refusal to surrender identity gave the Federation an edge the Borg could not assimilate. This belief is not entirely false, but it misses the deeper pattern. The Borg adapted to improvisation. They adapted to individuality. They adapted faster than any conventional power could respond. What they struggled with, what delayed them at critical junctures, was not external resistance, it was internal coherence. The collective was a civilization optimized for expansion, assimilation, and perfection through integration. But perfection through integration created dependencies. Dependencies on infrastructure, dependencies on communication, dependencies on the assumption that every node, every drone, every cube functioned as a seamless extension of a single will. When that assumption broke, even briefly, the entire system hesitated, and in those hesitations, the galaxy found room to survive. The Borg were not defeated. They were destabilized at the exact moments they should have won. The Borg collective functions as a distributed intelligence with no single point of failure. Every drone is a node, every cube is a sub-processing unit. The Queen, when she exists, acts as a focal point for coordination, but she is not the system itself. She is a structure the collective creates when centralized decision-making provides an advantage. This is not a weakness in design. It is an optimization for adaptability. A hive mind with no central authority cannot be decapitated. A fleet with no command hierarchy cannot be disrupted by command loss. The Borg do not rely on morale, on supply lines, on political cohesion, or on the kinds of institutional friction that slow every other galactic power. They expand, they assimilate, they integrate, and they do so without the inefficiencies that define biological civilizations. This is the system the Federation faced. Not an empire, not a military, a post-scarcity, post-individual civilization that treated entire species as raw material for self-improvement. The Borg did not conquer. They absorbed. And absorption was not an act of war. It was an act of inevitability. When the Enterprise D first encountered the Borg at System J-25, the encounter lasted minutes. One cube, one starship. The Enterprise fired every weapon in its arsenal. Phasers, photon torpedoes, concentrated bursts at maximum yield. The cube's shields adapted in real time. After the first volley, the weapons were useless. Picard ordered evasive maneuvers. The cube ignored them. It was not interested in destroying the Enterprise. It was scanning, sampling, cataloging. When it finally struck, it carved a section out of the saucer with a cutting beam, pulled the wreckage inside, and assimilated the crew members it found there. Then it moved on. The Enterprise survived, not because it resisted, but because the cube had gathered what it needed and deprioritized the engagement. That was the baseline. A single Borg cube could adapt to Starfleet's most advanced weapons in seconds and treat the Federation flagship as a specimen. The tactical implication was immediate. If one cube could neutralize the Enterprise that easily, a fleet of cubes could sweep through Federation space without meaningful resistance. And the Borg had access to thousands of cubes. They had assimilated civilizations spanning centuries of spacefaring development. They had integrated technologies from species the Federation had never encountered. Their drones included former Starfleet officers, Klingon warriors, Romulan scientists, species 8,472 hybrids after initial contact, and countless others. Every assimilated individual brought knowledge, tactical memory, and biological distinctiveness into the collective. The Borg did not just have superior technology, they had the accumulated tactical and scientific knowledge of hundreds of species refined into a single adaptive intelligence. The Federation had no counter to this, not in 2365, not in 2366, not even in 2373 after years of preparation. At Wolf 359, the Federation deployed 40 starships. The fleet included the latest designs, Galaxy-class starships, Nebula-class cruisers, Excelsior-class heavy cruisers upgraded with modern systems. It included experienced command staff, tactical officers who had studied the J-25 encounter, and ships armed with modulated phaser frequencies designed specifically to penetrate Borg shielding. The fleet was positioned at a strategic choke point with time to prepare. Starfleet knew the Borg were coming. They knew the route. They knew the target. Every advantage that doctrine and preparation could provide was in place. One cube destroyed the entire fleet in less than an hour. 39 ships, 11,000 personnel. The casualty rate approached total. The few survivors were pulled from wreckage after the cube moved past them toward Earth. The Borg did not stop to assimilate the debris. They did not stop to finish off damaged ships. They continued toward their objective without deviation. The fleet had been an obstacle, and the obstacle had been removed. The engagement was not a battle. It was a clearing operation. The cost to the Borg was zero. This was not a narrow victory. This was not a battle where the Borg suffered losses and pressed forward. This was systemic overmatch. The Federation deployed its best, and the Borg adapted in real time, absorbed the tactics, and continued. The modulated phasers worked for seconds, then stopped working. The concentrated fire patterns were analyzed and countered. Every tactic the fleet attempted was integrated into the collective's tactical database and rendered obsolete within moments. The Borg learned faster than Starfleet could adapt, and they retained that knowledge. Every encounter made them stronger. Every tactic used against them became a tactic they understood and could counter instantly in every future engagement. The only reason the cube did not reach Earth and assimilate the Federation's home system was Jean-Luc Picard, not Starfleet, not the fleet. One man, temporarily assimilated as Locutus, retained enough residual independence to provide Data and Worf with a single exploitable command pathway. Data used that pathway to issue a command that triggered a regeneration cycle, forcing the cube into a feedback loop that caused it to self-destruct. This was not a replicable strategy. This was not a tactical doctrine. This was a unique circumstance created by the Borg's decision to assimilate a specific individual, and that individual's ability to resist full integration long enough to create a vulnerability. Remove Picard from the equation, and Earth falls. The cube completes its mission. The Borg assimilate the Federation's industrial core, Starfleet command, and the political leadership. From that position, the collective can expand through Federation space, system by system, with no organized resistance. The margin was one man's partial resistance to assimilation. The Borg returned. They always returned. In 2373, a single cube entered Federation space on a direct course for Earth. Starfleet had spent years preparing. New ship classes, new weapons, new tactics. The fleet that engaged the cube included the Defiant, a warship designed specifically for combat with the Borg. It included the Enterprise E, the most advanced ship in the fleet. It included dozens of ships positioned in layers along the cube's approach vector. The engagement lasted hours. The fleet rotated damaged ships out of the firing line. They concentrated fire. They used coordinated attack patterns. They modulated weapons continuously to delay adaptation. The cube still reached Earth. It still destroyed or disabled multiple ships. The fleet's losses were significant. And the cube was only stopped when Captain Picard, once again drawing on his residual link to the collective, identified a weak point in the cube's superstructure and directed the fleet to concentrate fire there. The cube was destroyed. But even in the process of its destruction, it launched a sphere. That sphere traveled back in time to prevent first contact between humanity and the Vulcans, an attempt to rewrite history and erase the Federation before it existed. The Enterprise E followed the sphere, destroyed it in Earth's past, and preserved the timeline. The Borg were defeated. Again. But the pattern is not defeat. The pattern is last-second intervention under extraordinary circumstances. The cube reached Earth. It required specific tactical knowledge held by one individual to be stopped. The sphere required temporal pursuit and another narrow engagement to prevent timeline disruption. These are not systemic victories. These are edge cases. And edge cases do not scale. The Borg lost individual engagements, but they never stopped adapting. They never stopped expanding. And they never stopped returning. The Federation believes it survived the Borg through technological and tactical innovation. That belief is reinforced by the victories recorded in the historical archive. But those victories were defensive. They were reactive. They were achieved at the moment of crisis, under circumstances that could not be relied upon to repeat. The Borg, by contrast, adapted proactively. They integrated every encounter into their strategic database. They assimilated technologies from species specifically chosen to address weaknesses exposed in prior engagements. After Wolf 359, the collective assimilated species with enhanced tactical algorithms. After the encounter with species 8472, the collective developed biological countermeasures and began experimenting with alliances, an entirely new strategic behavior. The Borg were not static. They were learning how to operate in a multiverse of threats. They were evolving into a more flexible, more resilient system. Every delay the Federation imposed accelerated that evolution. The collective's greatest strength was also its most exploitable weakness. The hive mind relied on instantaneous communication across vast distances through a subspace network. Every drone, every ship, every installation was linked. That linkage allowed for perfect coordination. It allowed the collective to pool knowledge in real time. It allowed individual drones to act with the combined experience of trillions. But it also created a single point of failure. Disrupt the network, and the drones become disoriented. Sever the connection, and they lose cohesion. This was the vulnerability Hugh exploited. This was the vulnerability Icheb's pathogen exploited. This was the vulnerability Janeway exploited when she introduced a neurolytic pathogen into the collective via the Queen. But the Borg knew this. They had always known this. The network had redundancies, regional nodes, subnodes, backup coordination protocols. The Queen herself functioned as a redundancy, a centralized processing fallback when distributed coordination was compromised. The Borg adapted to network disruption the same way they adapted to weapons and tactics. They built resilience into the system. And every time the network was attacked, the collective refined its defenses. The Federation, meanwhile, relied on the same vulnerability repeatedly. When Hugh was introduced into a Borg subgroup carrying a cascading geometric paradox, the affected drones were severed from the collective and became individuals. This created chaos within that subgroup, but the collective quarantined the affected drones and continued. When Voyager encountered those same individualized drones years later, they were a fractured, unstable group led by Law. They posed no threat to the collective itself. The network had contained the infection. The system had adapted. The Federation's greatest weapon against the Borg, individuality as a virus, was already being filtered out. Voyager's encounter with the Borg in the Delta Quadrant revealed the scope of the collective's strategic dominance. Voyager was alone. It was 70,000 light-years from Federation space. It had no reinforcements, no resupply, no support. And it encountered the Borg repeatedly over 7 years. In that time, Voyager destroyed multiple Borg cubes, disrupted transwarp hubs, sabotaged Borg infrastructure, and even formed temporary alliances with the collective against species 8472. A single Intrepid-class starship, operating in the heart of Borg territory, survived for years and inflicted significant tactical losses. This is often presented as evidence of Starfleet's superiority. But the pattern reveals something else. Voyager survived because the Borg deprioritized it. The collective had larger strategic concerns. Species 8472. Internal cohesion. Expansion into contested regions. A single isolated starship was not worth the resources required to fully eliminate it. The Borg engaged Voyager when their paths intersected, when Voyager threatened specific assets, or when Voyager represented an opportunity for assimilation. But the collective did not hunt Voyager. They did not redirect fleets to corner it. They did not treat it as a priority threat. And when Janeway finally struck at the collective's network infrastructure in the series finale, she did so using future technology from an alternate timeline, technology the Borg of that era had no data on and could not adapt to in time. The Borg lost that engagement not because Voyager was stronger, but because Janeway introduced a weapon the collective had not yet encountered and could not predict. It was, again, a narrow exploitation of timing and circumstance. Remove the future technology and the transwarp hub remains operational. Remove Janeway and the mission fails. Remove 7 of 9's tactical knowledge of Borg systems and Voyager never penetrates the network. Every major Federation victory against the Borg depended on variables the collective could not account for in advance. The Borg adapted to known threats. They struggled with unknown variables introduced by individuals acting outside established patterns. But individuals are not a replicable defense. Individuals die, individuals retire, individuals make mistakes. Doctrine, by contrast, persists. And the Borg's doctrine was expansion through assimilation. That doctrine did not require individual brilliance. It required only time. The Queen is often treated as the Borg's weakness, a centralized figure who can be killed and whose death disrupts the collective. This interpretation is incomplete. The Queen is not the collective. She is a manifestation of the collective's need for centralized coordination under specific conditions. When the Queen is destroyed, another is created. The individual personality may shift, but the function remains. The Queen in First Contact was different from the Queen in Voyager, but both served the same role. They coordinated. They interfaced with individuals. They represented the collective's intent in a form that could negotiate, manipulate, and adapt tactically in real time. The Queen's existence is not a flaw, it is an optimization. When the collective faces an opponent that uses decentralized tactics, unpredictable behavior, or psychological warfare, the Queen provides a focal point for counter-adaptation. She can anticipate. She can prioritize. She can make decisions that a fully distributed intelligence might hesitate on due to consensus delays. The Queen accelerates certain strategic calculations, and when she is killed, the collective simply regenerates the function. This is why killing the Queen never stopped the Borg. Janeway killed the Queen in the finale of Voyager. The Borg were severely disrupted. The transwarp network was damaged, but the collective was not destroyed. It was destabilized. And destabilization is temporary. The Borg rebuild, they adapt, they continue. The historical record treats the destruction of the transwarp hub as a decisive blow. But a decisive blow is only decisive if it prevents recovery. The Borg recovered from worse. They recovered from the loss of entire cubes. They recovered from the loss of regional nodes. They recovered from species 8472. They recovered because recovery is what the collective is optimized for. The only scenario in which the Borg do not recover is total systemic collapse, and nothing the Federation deployed, not even future technology, achieved total systemic collapse. The Borg should have won at Wolf 359. They should have assimilated Earth. They should have expanded through Federation space, system by system, absorbing infrastructure, personnel, and knowledge. From that position, they could have assimilated the Klingon Empire, the Romulan Star Empire, and every other Alpha Quadrant power. The combined resources of the quadrant would have accelerated the collective's growth exponentially, and with that growth, the Borg would have become unstoppable. Not because they were perfect, but because no conventional power had the industrial capacity, the technological base, or the strategic cohesion to resist sustained assimilation. The Borg nearly achieved this. They were stopped by Locutus. They were stopped by Picard's residual independence. They were stopped by a single exploitable command pathway that Data used to trigger a self-destruct sequence. The margin was seconds. The margin was one man's ability to retain fragments of his identity under full assimilation. That is not a victory. That is a statistical anomaly. And statistical anomalies do not prevent inevitability. They delay it. The Borg's strategy was not flawed, it was patient. They did not need to conquer the galaxy in a single campaign. They did not need to deploy overwhelming force in every engagement. They needed only to continue, to adapt, to assimilate. Every encounter added to their knowledge. Every species absorbed made them more resilient. Every tactical setback refined their doctrine. The Borg were not deterred by losses because they did not experience loss the way biological civilizations do. A destroyed cube was a temporary reduction in resources. The drones could be replaced. The technology could be rebuilt. The knowledge gained from the engagement was permanent. The Federation, by contrast, could not afford losses. Every ship destroyed was a loss of trained personnel, irreplaceable experience, and industrial investment. Every system threatened required defensive deployment. Every Borg incursion forced Starfleet to divert resources from exploration, diplomacy, and internal stability. The strategic cost of defending against the Borg was cumulative. The longer the collective remained a threat, the more the Federation was forced into a defensive posture. And a defensive posture is not sustainable. Not against an enemy that learns from every engagement and never stops expanding. The real question is not why the Borg lost. The real question is why they hesitated. The Borg encountered the Federation in 2365. They assimilated Picard in 2366. They launched a second incursion in 2373, 7 years between the first encounter and the second major assault. 7 years during which the collective could have deployed dozens of cubes, hundreds of spheres, and assimilated the Federation in a coordinated campaign, but they did not. They sent 1 cube in 2366. They sent 1 cube in 2373. The collective treated the Federation as a low-priority target, and that hesitation is what allowed the Federation to survive. The simplest reading is that the Borg did not view the Federation as a significant threat. The technology was inferior. The population was small compared to other regions of the galaxy. The industrial capacity was limited. The collective was engaged in expansion across multiple fronts, in multiple quadrants, against species far more advanced than the Federation. The Alpha Quadrant was a secondary theater, and secondary theaters receive secondary resources, but that reading does not account for the Borg's behavior after Wolf 359. After the first incursion, the collective had full access to Starfleet's tactical database through Picard's assimilation. They knew the Federation's strengths, weaknesses, fleet deployments, and strategic priorities. They had the data necessary to plan a systematic campaign, and they chose not to deploy it. The second incursion was again a single cube. No follow-up, no secondary wave, no overwhelming force. This suggests the Borg were constrained, not by the Federation, but by internal priorities. The collective was optimizing for something other than rapid territorial expansion in the Alpha Quadrant. The most likely constraint is species 8472. Voyager's encounter with the Borg in 2374 revealed that the collective was losing a war against species 8472, a species from fluidic space whose biology could not be assimilated and whose technology could destroy Borg cubes with single shots. The Borg were fighting for survival, and survival against an existential threat took priority over expansion into the Alpha Quadrant. This is the structural limit that delayed the Borg. Not Federation resistance, not tactical ingenuity. External pressure from a threat the collective could not immediately adapt to. And when that pressure eased, when the Borg developed countermeasures with Voyager's assistance, the collective resumed its expansion. The transwarp network was strengthened. New cubes were deployed. The Borg began accelerating their assimilation campaigns, and the only thing that stopped them was Janeway's introduction of a future pathogen and the destruction of a critical transwarp hub. Remove species 8472 and the Borg assimilate the Alpha Quadrant by 2370. Remove Janeway's future intervention and the transwarp network remains operational, allowing the Borg to deploy forces across the galaxy at unprecedented speed. The Federation survived because the Borg were fighting a two-front war, and one of those fronts temporarily took priority. The Borg were never defeated. They were interrupted. The contradiction at the heart of the collective is that perfection through assimilation creates dependencies that cannot be fully eliminated. The network that allows instantaneous coordination across light years is also a vulnerability. The reliance on technological superiority makes the collective slow to adapt to entirely novel threats like species 8472's organic technology. The assumption that all species can be assimilated makes the Borg hesitate when they encounter a species that cannot be integrated. These contradictions are not weaknesses in the conventional sense. They are the inevitable friction points of a system optimized for a specific kind of expansion, and they are the only reason the galaxy survived as long as it did. But the Borg were learning. Every contradiction exposed was a data point. Every failure was a lesson. The collective integrated biological countermeasures after species 8472. They refined their network security after repeated intrusions. They experimented with alliances, with negotiation, with tactics outside their traditional doctrine. The Borg of 2377 were more adaptable than the Borg of 2365, and that adaptation was accelerating. The Federation won individual battles. They survived critical incursions. They exploited narrow vulnerabilities at the exact moment those vulnerabilities were accessible. But they never stopped the Borg's expansion. They never dismantled the collective. They never forced the Borg into a strategic retreat. The Borg continued. They adapted. They rebuilt. And they remained the single greatest existential threat the galaxy had ever faced. The official story is that the Federation defeated the Borg through ingenuity, individuality, and moral resolve. The hidden story is that the Federation survived because the Borg were constrained by internal contradictions and external pressures the Federation did not create and could not control. The margin was never wide. The victories were never systemic, and the threat was never truly eliminated. The Borg should have won. They came within reach of an irreversible galactic realignment. They were delayed by individuals, by timing, by circumstance. But delay is not defeat. And the collective has time.